Yes.
I felt that the irony was really convincing.
Mm.
A lot of the examples that you gave seem like impossible situations. If you ever forgive and look past those.
Yeah.
But I think that, and everyone's still affected by culture, but I think that in America, we're affected by the culture of like the independent and don't need people.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like when something bad happens, we just move on.
Right.
But if we live like Jesus did, we have the grace that Jesus did, and we move into. And so I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot about forgiveness that's countercultural, for sure. Because we approach that stuff in kind of a proportional sort of way, in terms of how much do I need to forgive versus how much I've been hurt, and what do I do with that. And I think the constant rub in reading some of Idleman's stuff is there's a certain obligatory tone to it that I tend to resist a little bit. He's true, he's right in every point. He's right. The question is how does that motivate me day in and day out? And I don't, and I think a lot of people have this misconception about forgiveness is once and done versus how do we live forgivingly, and what exactly that looks like in terms of people. Because I mean, the reality is we live in relationships with people, and there are going to be bumps and bruises and emotional kind of scrapes and so forth. The question is, do those rise to the level of forgiveness, or is it just part of being human and being in human relationships? And I think it's a legitimate question, because the things that I think the things that rise to the level of rupturing the relationship are worthy of forgiveness. I think some of the other stuff, maybe. It just depends on the situation and what's going on in the relationship. It could be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back kind of stuff, which means that a lot of the other things that have happened previously have not really been addressed. And that's why the straw happens that way. So we're not paying attention to the logs that have been thrown onto the back and the things that I really needed to do the work of forgiveness anyway. But forgiveness is inevitably connected to this discussion of grace. It can't not be. But we got to be. I think we got to be really careful about how we're defining what forgiveness even is, because a lot of times we have some pretty distorted views on that too. So, any other reactions or questions or anything, reflections on the stuff you're reading? Yeah, Sarah.
For me, the Daring Greatly book has been really powerful. When I had just read the introduction, I was like suggesting the book to people, and I hadn't even opened chapter 1. So like, she almost
have you read it? No, just the introduction. It's
I was
fine.
like, the introduction is amazing, and I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, she just almost makes being vulnerable tangible, like something that we can check off the list or something. And I'm a list person. I like following instructions and stuff, and so it's been a really good read for me. And I think she was talking about how nowadays people see strength as being like independent or like being on your own and being closed off, but I think and then she talks about how it's important to realize that real strength comes from like showing the deepest parts of yourself, and the parts that hurt and that are broken. And I think, yeah, she just talks about it in a way that makes it easy to accomplish or easy to work towards.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I don't know. I'm fusing all of her books together that I've read, but has she mentioned Ordinary Courage yet?
Not
in this
yet.
book? And that goes to that point. I think she talks about it in the book that previous to the one I have you reading, and it's called "I Thought It Was Me and It Wasn't." And she actually talks about ordinary courage, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I think is that when we think of vulnerability, we think of just laying it all out and just kind of dumping on somebody all the deepest, darkest secrets we have. When in fact, ordinary courage would be allowing somebody to know us today, what's going on today, And I think we don't think of it in those terms, that actually takes courage. Let's redefine courage. Speaking honestly from one's heart, not doing something heroic. That's probably a good example of the ordinary courage we're talking about here. Any other reactions, thoughts? Yeah, Casey?
I thought it very greatly when she talked about like how men see vulnerability and like how it's just really not talked about. I thought that was really like convicting and powerful, and I realized that like I agreed with it, because a lot of people will say, oh, like I want a man that's vulnerable, or like it's so cool when guys are vulnerable, but then they really are. And like, wait, no, like that's not how man is supposed to be. Like you have to be strong. You have to like have it all together. You have to be able to provide. But when they're real about their struggles, then it's like, oh, like it's just a shot at their manhood. Like you're not a real man.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. The socialization process, particularly in the church, around what genuine biblical manhood, masculinity looks like, is so muddled for both genders that I had a friend of mine that actually wrote a book called Double Bind, and it was about the conflicting messages men get, and it goes to that same point. I want you to be strong, but don't be weak. And what exactly does weak mean? And so we end up really, and that's why I kind of pound the table so much about defining our terms, is that let's be really clear. What is strong actually? What is courage actually? If we're going to talk about this in really real terms. One of the reasons I'm going into this material is that Brene Brown talks in passing about boundaries. The problem I had when I read it was, yeah, but what if people don't understand what boundaries are? And she talks about it as if everybody knows. And it's like, not really. And that's exactly why this is such a issue. That's exactly why grace and shame is such an issue. So, yeah, that's a good point, Casey. Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting when I was reading. She said, when men are open and vulnerable with us, we can't stomach it. And then she was like, holy shit, I'm the patriarchy. I was like, that was so true. And it's like, for almost every single example of my life, I was just like, wow, as a woman, I want to understand how to even better just be more loving to men in my life. Like, whether it's my older brother or my best friend. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That blew my mind.
Yeah, the overarching principle that you will hear over and over and over again that applies to that is, I admire your vulnerability. I am repulsed by my own. And with men, that would be amplify that by 100-fold. So it's great. You're vulnerable. Yay. In certain areas. But I sure as hell am not going into that area. So, yeah.
I guess for me, like, the biggest question I had reading through all of that was, so, like, the idea that, like, shame for men is, like, I'm soft or I'm weak. Like, how do we separate, like, being soft from being vulnerable? Because, like, I think we've, like, almost entabled the two. It's like, oh, like, he's soft and vulnerable. And it's like, they're not the same thing, but how do we make that?
Well, I think we have to talk about our definitions and confront the ones that we carry ourselves. I mean, obviously, a guy has to do that too. But I think the challenge for women as well is, when I say I want a guy who is strong, what exactly does that mean? And if you've actually seen it, how do you react to it? Not in theory. Because, in a lot of cases, it goes back to that principle again. That's great, but then when I'm in relationship, remember how we talked about with safe people, we experience, or we kind of get into relationship based on external features, but then we get into relationship and we experience the internal features of that. And that's why that I think that definition changes. Is that on the outside we'll define strength and all of whatever the features are. But then when I start to experience them on the inside, it's like, wait, that's not what, I'd rather have the appearance of it rather than the reality of it. And that's true for all of us, really, is we're all, just at some level, we're all walking around creating an appearance of something, and people are buying it. What else do they have? But then when they actually start to experience it, it's feeling like a bait and switch. And we feel it too. Probably one of the fundamental basic fears people have that they walk around with and maybe never really utter is the idea that if somebody really knew me, they'd find out what a fraud I am. And I don't want to risk that. So, any other thoughts, reactions, questions? Yeah.
I don't know about this in my journal, but I feel like if I could sum up a lot of what Brene Brown is saying, is she's just saying show up in a lot of ways. And the part where she talks about like kind of like value is courage.
Yeah.
And to walk away from something that I don't know, you like failed in, or like whatever, you took a risk in and it didn't go like the way you wanted it to go or how you expected, whatever. If your value is courage, you can walk away saying like, I value courage.
Yeah.
I took a risk and like I can move on. And so I feel like a lot of what she's saying is just like show up.
Right.
And I know for like me, it's like I won't show up, or I won't walk away from something feeling like okay with it. It's not perfect. And if it didn't go perfectly or whatever, so how I approach everything is like with value of perfectionism.
Right.
And not a value of like just showing up.
Yeah.
And that's been big.
Yeah. No, I think the thing that I hear in that, and I talk about plenty, is I will show up only if you turn out to be safe. So so you say it's a value, but it's a value only if we get the desired response. Then it's not really a value. And that's where we drag some of these things into transactional kind of relationships, where it's if I, then you, and the minute I'm in that area, then I walk away and you don't respond the way I want you to, then I've done the wrong thing. Well, either it's a value or it's not. And if it's a value, then I'm going to do it irregardless of your reaction to it. And when I do it and I get a great response, good. I enjoy that. But when I get the response I don't desire or I don't like, good. I did what I valued. And that's the hardest thing, I think, is doing the things that we value irrespective of the reaction. A lot of the instances, even in the Christian world and in the Christian faith, and you look at people that we would look to as being heroes of the faith or saints or whatever you want to call them, and in that moment, they never think of it that way at all. It's like, how can I be this person that everybody looks up to? No. They're just living out their faith and their values irrespective of the reaction they get. And that's what we're being called to, I think, in a lot of ways, is being courage in the face of a response that is a resistance to it. And it happens to everybody. It happens to everybody. I've had it happen so many times in groups where I had it happen just 2 or 3 months ago. And I had a woman who was in the small group I lead, and she's 40-something, single, non-divorced, not ever been married, and was mentioning the holidays were approaching, and she was basically saying, I really fear the sense of loneliness I feel during the holidays. And that's what a lot of singles feel. And we had one woman in our group that said, yeah, but you got to remember that you're God's daughter and you're loved. And I did all I could to sit on my tongue, but I couldn't stop myself. And I looked at the woman that was receiving, is that true? Yes, it is true. It's a big T truth. in a little t description. So, is it true? Yeah, absolutely. So I looked at the woman that and she's a teacher, she's a very articulate lady, and I said, does that really help? And she did the most courageous thing she could have done. She said, no, it doesn't help. And this woman that was spouting the big T truth absolutely lost it. She absolutely lost it because she looked at her, and I thought, I would never hear these words out loud. And the words were, well, whether or not it helps you or not, it should help you. And then I ratcheted up. Because it's like, this woman does not deserve to be treated this way. And so I gently got in her grill and said, do you desire to help her based on what she needs or what you desire to say that sounds so important? And with that, the group was over. And everybody who was in my group was so conflict averse and so wigged out over the level of conflict. It wasn't that much conflict. She was getting really, really wigged out. I'm perfectly calm. I've seen wig out before. It's not a big deal. It's like, whatever. But my wife is absolutely turning herself inside out with her codependency blowing up. and it was like, what do you want? What do you want? And I want her to believe what's true. So you don't care what she needs. Really. And she's not going to change. And I walked away. I had to debrief with 3 or 4 different people. It's like, was I too harsh? Did I say something? Everybody has those doubts. And yet, the one thing that confirmed the fact that if I did, quote unquote, the right thing was that the teacher came up to me afterwards and she said, thank you for protecting me. And that was all I needed. It was like, okay, my value holds. But everybody else in my group was so wigged out about the conflict, whatever. So my point is, we all feel that way. We all do. And we say what we value, but then when it really push comes to shove and relationships start pushing back on it, if our value is based in the relationship and not based on the thing that we say we value, then we're going to get shaken, and that's okay. We need people to kind of do some reality checks with to make sure that we weren't out on a limb and intentionally hurt somebody or something like that. And the funny thing about it was my second oldest daughter, who says she's an atheist, was there for the conversation my wife and I were having with the debrief, and she saw a very different side of what she has caricatured Christianity as being. And it wasn't like I was trying to engineer it. She was there for it. And of course, everybody comes running to my defense. And it's like, that's not my point. My point is the value that matters here. So, anything else? Any other reactions or anything? Okay, let me pray, and then we'll try to unpack some of this stuff. Father, guide and direct our hearts. Open our hearts to listen and hear the words you have for us this morning. It's pretty easy to get drawn into a mastery of the information instead of the impact of that information on us. Help us just to take it and to question it and wrestle with it and see ways that we can learn and we can do things differently, not ways that we can just heap more shame on, I should have and I could have and that sort of thing. Give us the courage to be able to learn and do things a little bit differently. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I don't know if this video is going to work. I know a lot of you guys have probably seen this before, and it may or may not. The video wasn't originally designed to demonstrate boundarylessness, but I for about 4 or 5 years, I was a teaching pastor at a church. There was a plant from a church in Illinois, and we had a fantastic production team, and so they got fairly bored one day, and they put this video together. And this is what happens when production teams don't have anything to do. And so it is the guy that is pictured in this. If we don't have sound, I'll explain it. We'll move on, but hopefully this will work. So let's see what happens here. Yeah, I'm guessing that this is not going to work. Yep, no, it's not. I will put it up so that you can watch it. Basically, it was their version of the fake British accent guild, and it's a story about a guy by the name of Greg Samaritan who believed that he was of the great lineage of the Good Samaritan, and that compelled him to do good things. And at some point in time, they confronted the fact that doing good things was a choice. It wasn't necessarily in his blood, so to speak. So I'll put it up so you can take a look at it. Now, so in the physical world, we have lots of examples of boundaries all the time. We don't think anything about them. As a matter of fact, we don't think they're immoral, or we don't think that they're medieval, or any of the things that is in the current debate, at least. But fences, walls, I don't know anybody have moat around their house, manicured lawns, hedges. The question is, why are boundaries so important, and why do we do them at all? And fundamentally, the idea is, and the reason is, because they demarcate what anybody know? What I own. When you buy a house, in your deed is the dimensions of the property that you own. And for a lot of people, what they do with these boundaries is that they demarcate where those boundaries lie, with a fence, with, like it says, a hedge, like a number of different things that we tend to do like that. I think I've told this story before. When we lived in Illinois, we were in an unincorporated part of the city we were living in, and there were no fences at all in all the houses. Everybody knew where their boundary lines were. We'd mow our lawns accordingly. But when the kids went out, they didn't care. And so my lawn and my yard was every bit as much a part of their yard as anyone else's. And they could roam a long ways, and all the neighbors didn't think really much about it at all. But boundaries demarcate what we own. Even a bigger concept here is they also demarcate what we're responsible for. And that's why they're so important when it comes to the world in which we live. In the spiritual world, boundaries define our soul. I've been using this verse, and we've been talking a lot about this verse when we say the idea, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it is the well springs of life. Well, a well, in order to produce its best product, needs to be cared for, and somebody needs to take responsibility for it. And your heart is that well. And you are the well keeper. And it is no one else's well. It is yours. And boundaries are a way to do that. The writer of Proverbs goes so far as to say, guard your heart, in other translations, for it is the wellspring of life. And that guarding is not guarding something that is like a criminal outlaw or something like that. It is very much a part of guard something of infinite value. And so boundaries demarcate the things that are our soul and our hearts, and we have to be mindful of what it is. The other part about it is that it also marks what is me and what is not me. In other words, what is me and what is you. Now, if you get really mired in the concrete, of course, I'm me and you're you, and et cetera, et cetera. In the physical world, that's pretty simple to understand. because we look enough different and all these various dimensions that make us different, and we think the difference defines the boundaries for us to respect. The problem is when you get into the more emotional part of the world, the boundaries get pretty fuzzy. And the reason that this is such an issue when we're talking about shame and grace is about the fact, and we'll talk about this later, is that grace is about empowering and freeing people, and shame is about controlling people or controlling me so that I can control people. Most of these are always connected in some fashion or another. So suddenly me and not me is not as clear as we think it is. And that's a part of how we go about doing that. So what goes on in my heart, I'm the only one that knows about that. Well, it's now, clearly, there are lots of people that don't spend a lot of time looking at what's going on in their heart. So you ask them what they're feeling or what they're, usually thinking is an easy one. But you ask them what they're feeling, they may say, I don't know. And that may be an honest answer. Because they don't know, because they don't look. And so self-reflection is a part of really caring for our heart and caring for what's going on within it. So there's one major verse that I want to spend a little time talking about, and it's a verse in Galatians 2 and 5 that we all know pretty well. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he's something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. But each must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone and not in regard to another. For each one will bear his own load. What I want to focus on here is this passage is one that I refer to as the boulders and backpacks verse. And the reason I do is that this idea of a burden in the Greek literally means boulder. It is a crushing, flattening weight that nobody can carry. And that the person who is carrying it is carrying something so heavy that we are called upon to carry it with them. And in this sense, and in this conversation, these prepositions really, really, really do matter. Because at times, those of you guys that are in crisis and trauma, we can talk about this as well, is that at times I probably need to carry the burden for the other person. And so being responsible for them at a time when they don't have the resources to do that themselves. But at some point it crosses over to, how can I be responsible to somebody? And that's what down here is, okay? So we've got boulders up here, boulders that are so big that people can't possibly carry it, and I'm called to be responsible for that person because they're incapable of carrying that weight. And then down below, somebody says, now wait a minute, Paul, you're using the same terms. And no, he's not, because actually this load down here, literally in the Greek, is knapsack. And what do we carry around in our backpacks? Everything we need for our day. Not anybody else's day. You're not carrying books in there for somebody else. You might. That might be really nice of you. But most of what you carry in your backpack is yours and yours alone. And it's your daily responsibilities you carry around. It's symbolic of that. So when Paul says, let's be clear, I need to come alongside people that are carrying burdens, that have a boulder on their back, whether that's a crisis they've gone through, to use the terms of the other class, the trauma that they've experienced, whatever that might be, and they don't have the skill, they don't have the resources, they don't have the ability to carry it. I need to be responsible for them for a time. But there are lots of people, and I'm sure you know them, there are lots of people who whine and moan and everything else about their daily load. And being responsible to that person is to say, let me find a way to encourage you to carry what's yours and yours alone, nothing else. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind, particularly in the world of because we've got these two kind of classes kind of crashing together, the thing to keep in mind is that there are lots and lots of people who have gone through trauma, who have experienced all sorts of crises, and the only way that they can manage it is to minimize it and turn it into, well, what I've gone through, everybody else has gone through, it's no big deal anyway, it's just a load. When in fact, it's a burden. And there are those people, like I said, that tend to reverse that, carry around their loads and act like it's a burden. The challenge in any of our relationships, particularly when we're around people that are wrestling with life, is to go back and what I talked about in terms of discernment. Is this something that this person doesn't have the resources to handle themselves, and I do, and I have the capacity to help them and be responsible for them for a time? On the other hand, do they have the resources, and I just need to encourage them to use those resources to carry the burden that's the load that's theirs and theirs alone? There's some really murky water between those two extremes. I mean, there are plenty of people that I've talked to over the years who have gone through some really, really traumatic things and act like it's no big deal. Why? Because it's easier to carry that way. And they need somebody outside of them to look them in the eye and say, that must have been incredibly traumatic. And I will tell you, I've had lots of people say, I guess I just never thought of it that way. Because we're sure that if I admit that something is as traumatic as it is, I will be overcome and I will not be able to function and I will look weak and people will think that I'm making a bigger deal out of it than I am. And guess where we're landing? In the world of shame. We're landing in the world of shame. And it doesn't take long. I mean, we're circling, we're orbiting that world, and it takes very, very little for us to step into it. Because shame is a very efficient way to manage pain. It's a very efficient way to manage pain. Grace isn't. Grace invites us to feel it. And to not make a snap judgment about our character and to learn and to maybe do something different or admit my weakness and need, like we mentioned about talking about safe people. What marks a safe person is somebody who recognizes their need, not their neediness, and asks for somebody to meet it. Hard stuff, very, very, very difficult stuff to do. But it's a reality of this whole thing about boundaries is being clear about what's mine and what isn't mine. And I can still come alongside somebody, be responsible for them, always keeping in my mind, how can I look for ways to help them grow to be able to carry this themselves? Now, some burdens were never meant to be carried alone. Some aren't. And in the course of time of sharing and being willing to walk in and talk about that stuff, a lot of times the burden begins to break apart and become more manageable to carry. Yeah, Shelby?
How are we to distinguish what burden just goes to share with others?
Well, that would go back to our conversation about safe people. It would go back to that. That's why these things typically are connected together when I talk about them. Because in some cases, the burdens that we carry, when we're around safe people, we should still, because safe people are still human and can be unsafe at times, I think we still have to share small portions of it in order to see, and not as a test, but to discern the nature of the person that I'm sharing it with. So the burden that I'm carrying, the things that are part of my life experience and the things that have affected me, there are some people that I've got pretty much carte blanche that I can share all of it and they can carry it and bear it with me. There are probably more people that I'm not real sure, and I need to do it incrementally, little bits at a time, to see how they handle that. And that's a small group experience. I mean, you don't know. You get into that and you don't know. But over time, you begin to see people that are probably going to be safe people that you can share more and more. And there's always, remember, the other thing Brene Brown talks about with vulnerability is not only boundaries, but mutuality. So you share, and the other person says, yeah, me too, I've gone through that. I have experienced just exactly the same thing. And then you begin to understand and build this kind of safe place to be able to share some of this stuff. So the material that we went through with Safe People was inviting us not to judge other people, but to discern the nature of the people we are in relationship with and understand their limits. And it's not condemning somebody. And you may not get it right. You might not. Some people can surprise you that they're a lot safer than you thought they were. And so it's just being mindful and discerning about the nature of the people that we're in relationship with. I've said this before, just because somebody's a Christian doesn't make them safe. Just because you're part of a group that says it's Christian doesn't make it safe either. A lot of it hinges on the leader that is there in terms of trying to make that place someplace safe for people to talk about the things that they wrestle with and struggle with. But that's part of the key, I think, in terms of talking about these boundaries. And when it comes to offering help to somebody, and this goes to the second thing that we have to talk about this week, is that either we're offering it to them or we're demanding that they take it. And that's a violation of boundaries too. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So boundaries, what are they there for? They demarcate and help us to understand what's me and what's not me. It helps us to understand how to come alongside people versus encourage people. It also is a way to keep the good in and the bad out. One of the ways that because I was working on a devotional many years ago about boundaries itself, and Lynn and I spent a lot of time explaining to our kids about boundaries, and we found this very concrete metaphor of a fence, and we described to them a lot of what I just described to you, is that your yard is your heart, and that's what you're responsible for, and the fence that you put around that is to demarcate what's yours and what isn't yours. But a fence always needs a gate. And that gate, there is only one gatekeeper. That's you. Not somebody else. Not somebody that says, well, I'm family, I get a free pass. Whatever that is, gates keep the good in and the bad out. That's what they're meant to do. And good boundaries are that way as well. So we need to have gates. We need to be able to say no, which is the most basic boundary word in our vocabulary. And we have to understand that because most people have not learned this material, there are those, which we'll talk about, like I said, in the second part of this week, there are those that hear no and only take it as a challenge to overcome. And the minute you find somebody that does that, you can say, this person is not going to respect my boundaries. And boundaries are not meant to separate me from somebody else. If anything, boundaries make it possible for me to be in truly a grace-filled relationship. Boundaries make that possible because we are differentiated from one another. We're clear about what we're responsible for. And grace is about inviting people, not demanding people, and not telling them what they should do or anything like that. Grace was given to us as a gift. Can gifts be refused? Yeah, they can. And the interesting thing about that is that God will take you at your word. And you say, no thanks. He said, okay. And the consequences we suffer are not God's problem. because he offers them. We have a telltale part of Romans 1 that says exactly that, where Paul makes it very clear in creation, people can know God's characteristics, his greatest qualities, and eventually they got to the point of saying, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. And what does it say? He, quote unquote, the words that Paul used, he gave them over. In other words, he said, okay, I will take you at your word, you will suffer the consequences. And that's really in a lot of ways where we are. So boundaries are not walls. People who try to impose walls in our relationship are not having good boundaries. They're just erring in the opposite direction from boundaries. Boundaries are not about separation. They're not about controlling other people. They're not about telling you what you can and cannot do. But it is being clear about what I will go along with, what I will be a part of, and what I won't. But we wander into a world, don't miss this point, we wander into a world where we let people be free. And I'm not sure we really like that. Not only do we not like our own freedom, we're not really crazy about other people's freedom either. Why? Because they can choose differently than you want them to. But if we're truly going to have a relationship on which love is built, love always flourishes in freedom. If it's anything less than freedom, it is not love. And that's why grace is such a big deal. And that's why so many Christians have such a pretty shallow understanding of grace. So, some examples. Your skin, it's an easy one. Keeps everything in. Words, I already mentioned the most fundamental words we have in our vocabulary for boundaries is no. And how many of us, you don't have to raise your hands, but how many of us, when we say no to somebody, we feel guilty? You have to do your own soul searching about why. And a lot of people burn out by not saying no, because saying no, in their mind, isolates them and leaves them alone, which also says probably why we don't say no. So boundaries allow us to develop more fully. Go back to what I said about they define our soul. They allow us to take the time to fully develop our own heart, our own well, if you will. If somebody comes along, well, like we talked about with the whole, safe people thing, what do I do that pushes you away? What do I do that draws you to me? And we tell somebody the truth, it is really a boundary statement. Because I'm saying, this is your impact on me. And I can say that because I own me enough to know what's going on in there. The people who just say, no, it's no big deal. It's great. It's working fine. And end up really casting a picture of reality that does not exist. Because that's rarely the case. People, except, in kind of minute, irrelevant sort of ways, most people have an impact on you. You may not spend a lot of time thinking about it unless it pulls or pushes the emotions up above a certain level of threshold, and you say, oh, that's irritating, or that draws me. But below that level, it's as if it doesn't exist. The people who do this boundary work within themselves are more capable of communicating to others the very thing that question asks. Because when you get, if somebody says, what do I do that pushes you away, when you get dogmatic and harsh and demanding, that pushes me away. And what's our response if somebody says that to us? Shame, right? It's like, oh, I'm the worst. if somebody were to walk into grace, and I know I've read a lot of your journals, and you're saying, okay, how? And my wife and I just had this conversation last night or whatever night it was, snowstorm, whatever. And I said, in a lot of cases, when people ask the question how, they are looking for guarantees to do it without consequences. So I want you to tell me how, so I have no risk, but I always have a guarantee of success. But if somebody says, this is what you do that pushes you away from me, or I want to draw away from you, and I walk into shame, before too long, what happens with the whole boundary thing is that they feel what? Guilty, right? Why? Because they made you feel bad about yourself. Versus somebody who is trying to grasp grace and says, okay, I'm going to resist the shame hole and say, help me understand how I do that. I mean, give me, if you can. See, the other thing we do is that the minute somebody says something is really uncomfortable to us about us, say, give me an example. And they say, well, I can't find or think of one. Oh, well, there you go. Anybody been in one of those families? All the time. And we do it with each other. And it's like, wait a minute. Because somebody's had the courage to tell me that, maybe I should listen. And just because they can't give an instance does not make it any less valid. Because that is their perception and that is their reality of me to them. Whether I agree with it or not, it does not matter. It doesn't matter whether I agree. Most of the time, we're legends in our own mind. And then when somebody bursts that bubble, we get pissed off because how dare they tarnish my legend? So the truth is that's why I make the distinction about truth the way I do. Because speaking the truth in love is speaking the truth in season according to the other person's need. It may not always need to be said. And when I'm patient and when I'm kind of hold back, what am I doing? And I would suggest to you, I'm trusting God with them. Rather than nominating myself as God's prophet in their lives. And that's hard. That is really, really difficult. Because we feel this sense of urgency to say something at that point. Because if we don't, after all hell's going to break loose in their lives. And then I'm going to be responsible for it. Yeah.
I was going to ask, kind of going back to the question of how.
Right.
Do you feel like asking the question how implies that there's like some sort of like accomplishment or destination that needs to be like reached or attained?
Absolutely.
So some of that like I'll sit in these classes and ask myself, okay, great. So if I can just like gain all these tools, learn how to be vulnerable, say person, whatever,
right?
And like I like think about it as if it's like it's not about the relationships; it's about
what you can attain.
What you can attain or what you can accomplish. So it's like almost it takes another form of like, okay, well this all sounds good, so I'll take on the role of like this sort of person and do that perfectly.
Right.
Tell me how.
Right.
And like in that even like missing the whole entire point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, people who give us steps to accomplish things, I'm not throwing them under the bus. At the same time, sometimes I think they do us a disservice because they tempt us into that way of thinking. Is that if I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then blammo, I'm a safe person. And that may or may not be true, but it creates an illusion of a ladder again, rather than how do I respond to another's needs. And when I do, it's confusing. There's uncertainty. There's all sorts of things that get in the way of doing, because we're hanging on to, I've got to hit that point in order to get it right, rather than I've got to find a way to relate and get to the person's heart somehow. Yes, Sarah.
So I'm taking a few steps back, but when you said earlier shame is an efficient way to handle pain, I've just been staring at it on my paper, trying to understand a little bit more what you mean by that.
Right.
So are you saying, like, when someone experiences something painful like heartbreak or losing a friendship or betrayal within a family, like, are you saying it's easier for them to, like, tuck that away and downplay it rather than deal with it, or what are you, like,
Well, remember what shame is about, okay? I mean, Brené Brown makes that distinction very quickly. Is guilt is about what? It's now time for you guys to talk. Guilt is related to what? Behavior. Shame is related to identity. So the way that I put it is that, shame is about personhood. It's about person, and guilt is about performance. What I mean by that when I say that is that when I experience heartache and heartbreak in a relationship or whatever that is, if I lapse into, well, if I wasn't this, that, or the other thing, if I had been this, that, or the other person, blah, 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 then it wouldn't have turned out that way. It takes us a long way away from just simply the heartache of having a relationship break up. And actually, it ends up kind of veering us away from what, which you've been in this class too, is grieving. And most of us don't have any idea how to grieve anyway. So we would rather, and the reality is that it's a lot easier to punish the person that's nearest to me, or point the gun or make somebody responsible nearest to me, than somebody who's far away that I can't get to. So going through the process of teasing apart what part I played, the responsibilities I have that perhaps disappoint me, and disappointment is different than shame, I can look at that and experience the pain that helped me to grow and change and so forth. But there is also a part the other person plays, and it's their responsibility. And I have seen too many people who have been traumatized by another person, and because the person's gone, they can't get at them, they can't really know where to point the gun. Instead, they point the gun at themselves. Yeah.
So would you say, like, because I recently went through something like that, and so would you say, instead of, like, placing blame on the other person, and instead of being like, well, what could I have done better, you're saying just to, like, feel that and be in that moment? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's part of the grieving process. I mean, we're going to have anger. We're always going to have anger. And the anger is going to get turned either outward or inward. And usually we would much prefer anger turned inward, because that's an object of punishment we agree with. Turning it outward seems really unsatisfying, because after all, if I turn it outward, the other person may not care. And that's pretty unsatisfying, If I'm going to punish somebody, the least they can do is be affected by it. But that most of the time just doesn't happen. So what do? We turn it in on ourselves. And that's why I say shame is more efficient to deal with pain. Because dealing with pain, there's no efficiency. There's nothing efficient about pain. There's nothing efficient about relationships either. Communication is thoroughly inefficient if we really allow it to exist the way God intended. So it includes all of those things. And I think the process of growth, if you will, rests in a willingness to experience what really hurts in the physical realm, we blame absolutely no one for being in the ICU or being in recovery. We don't blame anybody for that. But in the emotional realm, the minute that event is over, we blame them for, for being self-absorbed and all the other phrases we use. And we make the split in the emotional realm. And we say our values are people's well-being and taking care of their heart and all of that sort of stuff. But the minute we start interacting with them and have no idea what to say, we pull out big T truth and say, okay, this is how you get this done. Why? Because I feel uncertain, I feel confused, I feel I don't know how inadequate, I feel helpless. And sometimes when I feel that way in a relationship, maybe the thing to say is, I feel really helpless to be able to help you right now. Now that's pulling it into relationship. And guess what? The other person will say, wow, what I am going through may be such a big deal that I need to pay attention to that. Or my friend feels helpless to reach out. Or inadequate, or whatever that is. See, that we miss obvious things about dragging things into a relationship. It's far safer to drag big T truth into a relationship than to bring our little t world into the world that the person is also experiencing. Because to us, it solves no problems. But this is not a problem to be solved. This is a person to connect with. And the minute I start into problem-solving mode, the person will do an immediate calculation and say, what's wrong with me that they're trying to fix me? And I suspect everybody in this room knows what that feels like. We'd prefer a problem to be solved than to be connected with, because that does what? Goes back to Sarah's question. It goes back to when a person connects with me in the things that I'm experiencing, the confusion and everything else, I start feeling it because I feel safe. And they've affirmed that I'm a person worthy of connecting with. So, were you going to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm shifting gears, but I guess like when you have the courage to speak, so like you tell somebody, okay, I need this, like I either need you to do something or I need you to stop doing something because you're hurting me. And you kind of go out on a limb. My question and like my experience in the past 3 weeks of thinking about this is like in that waiting time, you're waiting for them to
choose
to choose to either respect you and like and love you and do what you need, or say like I can't. How do you hang there?
Yeah.
And I know I'm asking about like a how, but I was just thinking
uncomfortably.
Yeah, I just thought like what Brene Brown was talking about with like the joy, like quenching your joy of like you're waiting in this moment, and my brain automatically goes to they're never gonna do it.
Right.
This is just gonna end. This relationship is already failed.
Right.
And I just immediately I'm like they don't want me. So I just respect that.
Cut bait and run.
Yeah, I'm like here I'm giving you an opportunity to like step into this place and like, but I'm already checked out.
Right. Well, and it's reflexive in us to want to reduce the risk. It always is. I think that moment of waiting is the risk seems to be climbing in all of that, and yet it's that risk that makes relationships that much more fulfilling. Now, it also is that risk that makes them that much more damaging. But you can't have one without the other. All right? I mean, Brene makes it very clear that emotions are a package deal. You turn off one, all the other ones get turned off. And the same thing is true with relationships. It's risky business. And there's no simple way to say, well, how do I handle this? Well, maybe you have other safe people in your life who you can debrief with, who will encourage you to just stay put and let this thing play out. So. Okay, any other questions? Well, we've gotten as far as we can. Not nearly far enough, but I'm not counting that. So, see you Thursday. We'll talk some more. Amen.